It was one of those quiet London mornings where Baker Street seemed more a corridor of fog than a thoroughfare of life. The gas lamps still hissed faintly in retreat from the dawn, and I, Dr. John H. Watson, was seated across from Sherlock Holmes, who had just returned from one of his early constitutionals. The air in our sitting room smelt of damp wool and faint tobacco, for Holmes had not yet removed his overcoat and was drawing long, meditative puffs from his pipe, eyes half shuttered. "You are puzzled, Watson," he remarked without looking up, though I had not uttered a word. "You were about to ask what I discovered on my walk." "Indeed, I was," I admitted with a chuckle. "And I assume, by your tone, that it was something quite out of the ordinary." Holmes removed his pipe from his lips and gestured toward the table, where lay an object wrapped in brown paper. "Unwrap it and tell me what you see." I leaned forward, drew away the string, and peeled back the coarse paper. What I found inside was a leather-bound book, plain and unassuming, the sort one might find in any dusty corner of a second-hand shop. I opened it and blinked. The pages were all blank. "A journal?" I asked. "Hardly," said Holmes. "That is the latest and last work of Mr. Elliot Beresford, the reclusive novelist who has not published in over 5 years. Or rather, it was supposed to be." I turned back to the book. The leather cover bore no title, only the initials E.B. pressed into its spine. The texture of the pages suggested they had once held ink, but had been meticulously scraped or bleached clean. Not a single word remained. "Curious," I murmured. "You said it was meant to be his latest work?" Holmes nodded. Beresford arranged for the book's delivery to his publisher, a Mr. Charles Wyndham of Albemarle Street. Yesterday morning it arrived, sealed in wax and tied with this exact string. Wyndham opened it with his assistant, expecting the manuscript that had been promised for months. Instead, he found this. "And Wyndham came straight to you?" "Not directly. First, he visited Beresford's Chelsea residence. There, he was told by Beresford's housekeeper that the author had taken ill 3 days prior and was not receiving visitors. Wyndham, suspicious but polite, left without protest and arrived at Baker Street shortly after luncheon. His concern, he said, was not merely about the missing manuscript, but about Beresford himself." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp gaze tightening. "For Mr. Wyndham suspects, though he has no proof, that Beresford did not send the book at all. What would lead him to such a conclusion?" The handwriting on the wrapping was not Beresford's, nor was the seal his usual signet. And, more peculiarly still, the courier who delivered it gave a name Wyndham did not recognize. One Robert Flint. The name meant nothing to me. An impostor? Possibly, or perhaps a decoy. Either way, it has all the markings of a deception. And this morning, a telegram arrived from Chelsea. Beresford has not been seen since Monday evening. I sat up. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect something," said Holmes, "and I propose we travel to Beresford's home without delay." We arrived by cab in the mid-morning drizzle, the sky low and gray, threatening another rain. Beresford's residence on Carlisle Square was a handsome townhouse of 3 stories, with ivy clinging to its front as though seeking warmth. Holmes rapped sharply at the door, which was answered by a woman in her 60s, stern in posture, but with eyes that betrayed worry. "Mrs. Kipling?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir." "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We come at the behest of Mr. Wyndham regarding Mr. Beresford." The housekeeper blinked once, then stepped aside. "Come in," The parlor into which we were shown was modestly furnished but tasteful. On the hearth, the ashes were still warm. "Has Mr. Beresford returned since last Monday?" Holmes asked, after brief pleasantries. Mrs. Kipling shook her head. "Not a word. He said he'd be walking to the river to clear his head and never came back. At first, I thought perhaps he'd taken a room somewhere to write in peace, as he sometimes does, but now—" She trailed off, her lips thin with worry. "And no message? No telegram? Nothing. Did he mention a man named Robert Flint?" At this, the woman's brow furrowed. "Robert Flint? No, sir. Never heard that name spoken in this house." Holmes nodded and stood. "May we see his study?" Of course. We were led up a narrow flight of stairs to a book-lined chamber whose windows overlooked the back garden. A desk stood by the window, immaculately clean. Too clean. Holmes immediately crossed to it, bending low to examine its surface. "No recent writing," he muttered. "But look, Watson, do you see the indents?" I leaned in. Indeed. Faint impressions marred the polished surface. Holmes withdrew a small tin from his coat and began lightly brushing graphite over the wood. Slowly, ghostly outlines of letters began to emerge. "A page was written here," he said, half to himself. "Recently, and removed carefully." I peered closer. The imprint was fractured, difficult to read. But a single phrase caught my eye. "The dream will reveal the key." Holmes straightened slowly, his face sharpening with intent. A book without words. A writer who vanishes. And now, a phrase that suggests the dream contains a clue. He turned to Mrs. Kipling. "Did Mr. Beresford speak of any dream recently?" The housekeeper seemed flustered. "No, sir, but he had been locking his bedroom door at night. Said he'd been sleepwalking again." "Again," Holmes echoed. "He had bouts years ago. Said he'd walk and talk and never remember a thing by morning." Holmes turned to me with a gleam in his eye. "Watson, I believe this case has only just begun." Chapter 1. The Book Without Pages. It was one of those quiet London mornings where Baker Street seemed more a corridor of fog than a thoroughfare of life. The gas lamps still hissed faintly in retreat from the dawn, and I, Dr. John H. Watson, was seated across from Sherlock Holmes, who had just returned from one of his early constitutionals. The air in our sitting room smelt of damp wool and faint tobacco. For Holmes had not yet removed his overcoat and was drawing long, meditative puffs from his pipe. Eyes half shuttered. "You are puzzled, Watson," he remarked without looking up, though I had not uttered a word. "You were about to ask what I discovered on my walk." "Indeed, I was," I admitted with a chuckle, "and I assume, by your tone, that it was something quite out of the ordinary." Holmes removed his pipe from his lips and gestured toward the table, where lay an object wrapped in brown paper. "Unwrap it, and tell me what you see." I leaned forward, drew away the string, and peeled back the coarse paper. What I found inside was a leather-bound book, plain and unassuming, the sort one might find in any dusty corner of a second-hand shop. I opened it and blinked. The pages were all blank. "A journal?" I asked. "Hardly," said Holmes. "That is the latest and last work of Mr. Elliot Beresford, the reclusive novelist who has not published in over 5 years. Or rather, it was supposed to be." I turned back to the book. The leather cover bore no title, only the initials E.B. pressed into its spine. The texture of the pages suggested they had once held ink, but had been meticulously scraped or bleached clean. Not a single word remained. "Curious," I murmured. You said it was meant to be his latest work." Holmes nodded. Beresford arranged for the book's delivery to his publisher, a Mr. Charles Wyndham of Albemarle Street. Yesterday morning it arrived, sealed in wax and tied with this exact string. Wyndham opened it with his assistant, expecting the manuscript that had been promised for months. Instead, he found this. "And Wyndham came straight to you?" "Not directly. First, he visited Beresford's Chelsea residence. There, he was told by Beresford's housekeeper that the author had taken ill 3 days prior and was not receiving visitors. Wyndham, suspicious but polite, left without protest and arrived at Baker Street shortly after luncheon. His concern, he said, was not merely about the missing manuscript, but about Beresford himself." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp gaze tightening. For Mr. Wyndham suspects, though he has no proof, that Beresford did not send the book at all. What would lead him to such a conclusion? The handwriting on the wrapping was not Beresford's, nor was the seal his usual signet. And, more peculiarly still, the courier who delivered it gave a name Wyndham did not recognize. One Robert Flint. The name meant nothing to me. An impostor, possibly, or perhaps a decoy. Either way, it has all the markings of a deception. And this morning, a telegram arrived from Chelsea. Beresford has not been seen since Monday evening. I sat up. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect something," said Holmes, "and I propose we travel to Beresford's home without delay." We arrived by cab in the mid-morning drizzle, the sky low and gray, threatening another rain. Beresford's residence on Carlisle Square was a handsome townhouse of 3 stories, with ivy clinging to its front as though seeking warmth. Holmes rapped sharply at the door, which was answered by a woman in her 60s, stern in posture, but with eyes that betrayed worry. "Mrs. Kipling?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir." "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We come at the behest of Mr. Wyndham, regarding Mr. Beresford." The housekeeper blinked once, then stepped aside. "Come in." The parlor into which we were shown was modestly furnished but tasteful. On the hearth, the ashes were still warm. "Has Mr. Beresford returned since last Monday?" Holmes asked after brief pleasantries. Mrs. Kipling shook her head. "Not a word. He said he'd be walking to the river to clear his head and never came back. At first, I thought perhaps he'd taken a room somewhere to write in peace, as he sometimes does. But now—" She trailed off, her lips thin with worry. "And no message, no telegram? Nothing. Did he mention a man named Robert Flint?" At this, the woman's brow furrowed. "Robert Flint? No, sir, never heard that name spoken in this house." Holmes nodded and stood. "May we see his study?" "Of course." We were led up a narrow flight of stairs to a book-lined chamber whose windows overlooked the back garden. A desk stood by the window, immaculately clean. Too clean. Holmes immediately crossed to it, bending low to examine its surface. "No recent writing," he muttered. "But look, Watson, do you see the indents?" I leaned in. Indeed, faint impressions marred the polished surface. Holmes withdrew a small tin from his coat and began lightly brushing graphite over the wood. Slowly, ghostly outlines of letters began to emerge. "A page was written here," he said, half to himself, "recently, and removed carefully." I peered closer. The imprint was fractured. Difficult to read, but a single phrase caught my eye. "The dream will reveal the key." Holmes straightened slowly, his face sharpening with intent. A book without words. A writer who vanishes. And now, a phrase that suggests the dream contains a clue. He turned to Mrs. Kipling. Did Mr. Beresford speak of any dream recently? The housekeeper seemed flustered. No, sir, but he had been locking his bedroom door at night. Said he'd been sleepwalking again. Again, Holmes echoed. He had bouts years ago. Said he'd walk and talk and never remember a thing by morning. Holmes turned to me with a gleam in his eye. Watson, I believe this case has only just begun. Chapter 2. Holmes' First Deduction. The Unmarked Courier. Sherlock Holmes took to pacing in the narrow hallway outside Beresford's study. His long, deliberate steps echoed across the wooden floor. I followed, notebook in hand, acutely aware that the scent of graphite and aged paper still clung to the desk inside. Holmes paused before the window and looked outward, though his eyes seemed fixed on some point within his own mind. Watson, he began, without turning, observe not just the presence of the ghost writing, but the absence of ordinary behavior. Mrs. Kipling mentioned Beresford locking his bedroom door, and therefore the nightly departures, yet the study has shown no sign of forced entry. That indicates— He stopped and turned toward me, tapping my shoulder. A domestic intruder would need access, but someone known to the house would not. Therefore, the study's breach was internal, or conducted with aid from within. I nodded, struck by the precision of his reasoning. Mrs. Kipling re-entered then, carrying a tea tray, but hesitant as she noticed Holmes and me holding our analytical posture like duelists. "I thought you might like a cup before returning," she said in a quiet voice. Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you. We must be cautious with our inquiries, Mrs. Kipling. We tread on delicate ground." She set the tray, then lingered. Her eyes flicked toward the far door. "Sir Eliot keeps many secrets," she said finally, for which I excused him, until his sleepwalking began again. Holmes watched her closely. "What changed, Mrs. Kipling?" Her gaze dropped. "A man. A young man. He brought a package. Sir Eliot seemed pleased, but he wouldn't say who sent it." Holmes smoothed his brow. "Mrs. Kipling, this Robert Flint, is there any chance you might have met or heard of him since?" She hesitated. "I thought I did, but only once. In a carriage, near the house. He declined to leave a card." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A courier aware of London roads yet anonymous. He knew the house routine, and penetrated it without alarm. He delivered the blank book with precision. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, consider the blank pages and scraped surface," Beresford wrote, and then removed the text. "That implies silent coercion or secret purpose, but the delivery was performed with due ceremony and wax. So the courier was complicit." I felt a chill. "You mean Flint is part of the scheme?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, either a messenger or the true author. One who needed the book to appear legitimate, to the eyes of Mr. Wyndham." Holmes poured tea, his hands steady. The dream phrase, "the dream will reveal the key," was the imprint, and the blank book is that phrase given form. It hints at the idea, not the words. I sipped the tea, its warmth contrasting with the tension. But why leave the book empty? Holmes returned his gaze toward Mrs. Kipling, because the value lies not in the writing, but in its promise. The blankness is its own cipher. Seconds later, the house door opened. A cab dropped at the curb. Mrs. Kipling hurried to the hall and returned with a visitor. "A Mr. Charles Wyndham," she announced, and ushered him into the room. Holmes rose to greet him. Wyndham was a well-dressed man in his late 40s, with graying hair at the temples, and a distinguished air tinged with both anxiety and expectation. "Mr. Wyndham," Holmes said, "thank you for your prompt arrival. Please make yourself comfortable." Wyndham lowered himself into the chair Mrs. Kipling offered. "I am grateful," he said. "I feared you might dismiss me out of hand after delivering that empty file of leather." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I see no file, only a book." Wyndham's eyes flicked to the object on the table. "Yes, but it was supposed to contain volume 99 of Beresford's novel, his magnum opus." "Your cue," Holmes said softly, "your expectation, and perhaps his collapse." Wyndham stiffened. "He's unwell, Holmes. I've no doubt of that. But I fear it is more than a lethargy or writer's block. I fear harm." Holmes steepled his fingers. Mrs. Kipling described his sleepwalking episodes. "Have any injuries been found? Bruises, scratches, or any odd belongings missing from his rooms?" Wyndham hesitated. "Only fragments of paper. They've appeared beside his bed sometimes, only to vanish by morning." Holmes exchanged a look with me. "Dream notes," he stated, "and removed, either by the sleeper or another." Wyndham leaned forward. "I asked Beresford about them once. He said the dream was writing itself inside his mind, words appearing and vanishing. He seemed terrified." Holmes relaxed into his chair. "That is unsurprising. If someone is projecting ideas through his dream, but not providing the text, he would sense its pressure without release." He stood suddenly. "We must inspect the bedroom." Wyndham drew in his breath. Mrs. Kipling looked stoic but concerned. Holmes led the way up the staircase. I followed. The house felt colder now, as though tension had seeped into the walls. Beresford's bedroom door was locked. Holmes produced a key obtained during his earlier observation from Mrs. Kipling's keys. It opened silently. Inside, the air smelled of lavender sachets and cold cotton sheets. The window faced the street, but the blinds were drawn. The bed was neatly made, though the floor beside it was bare of any scrap of paper. Holmes moved to the small writing table in the corner. A chair had been pushed aside, and a sliver of moonlight fell upon the polished wood. There were faint impressions here, too. Previous writing, written and removed. Holmes knelt and traced tiny ridges with his fingertips. "Again," he murmured. "Words left and then erased. It speaks of an involuntary scribble, wiped by the sleeper." He glanced at me. "The bedroom is an extension of the study. Beresford writes in his sleep, or attempts to, but the book never arrives. Instead, the courier brings the empty copy." Holmes rose and surveyed the room. "Someone is harvesting his mental drafts, and someone is delivering a decoy." He paused. "Wyndham, are you aware of any rival, perhaps desperate for your disappointment? Another publisher, or curious intellectual?" Wyndham blinked. "No, but Beresford had a student admirer, a young woman, Dr. Marian Arkwright. She studied under him at Oxford. I had heard he had become infatuated with her." Holmes fixed him with a steady gaze. "Then her motive is clear. She sought to harvest his ideas and reap their final form herself." Mrs. Kipling gasped softly, and I felt a twist of dread. Holmes turned back to me. "Watson, we must speak with Dr. Arkwright. I suspect the dream will reveal her guilt." And so, with the mystery deepening by a single blank page, Holmes led us from the chamber toward the next stage of this curious mental puzzle, a crime not committed by hand but by thought. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Arkwright Hall. Dr. Marian Arkwright was not an easy woman to find. According to Mr. Wyndham's recollection, she had taken a post at Arkwright Hall, a modest academic residence affiliated with Girton College, where she was rumored to be conducting research on dreams and the unconscious in literature. Holmes, upon hearing this, grew unusually quiet. "She harvests the ether of the mind," he muttered to himself as our hansom cab trundled along the wet Cambridge road, "and in so doing robs the writer of his waking soul." The rain had softened to a mist by the time we arrived. The great door of Arkwright Hall, tall, ivy-streaked, and carved with scholastic crests, creaked open at our knock. A stooped porter, pale-eyed and rheumatic, admitted us into the tiled vestibule with the weary grace of one who had long stopped being surprised by visitors. We were shown into the parlor, where Dr. Marian Arkwright awaited. She stood as we entered, a woman of perhaps 30 years, with sharply defined features, dark auburn hair pinned precisely, and eyes like polished hematite. Her manner was both welcoming and guarded, and though she extended a hand to Holmes, she did not miss the subtle sweep of his eyes over her bookshelves, window latches, and inkstand. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I feared I might one day receive a call from Baker Street." Holmes inclined his head. "And why should that be, Dr. Arkwright?" She offered a small, knowing smile. "Because Elliot Beresford is unraveling, and wherever unraveling occurs, you tend to follow." Holmes offered no reply, but sat in the high-backed chair across from her, fingers steepled. I cleared my throat. "We understand you were close to Mr. Beresford during his time at Oxford." "We were cordial colleagues," she replied smoothly. "I was one of his best doctoral candidates. He supervised my work on the semiotics of dreams." "You have remained in contact since?" I asked. "Occasionally, a letter here or there." He admired my paper on literary symbolism derived from oniric patterns. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "And did he ever express to you that his own dreams were not entirely his own?" She froze, just slightly, enough for Holmes to catch it. But then her voice came, cool and measured. "He suggested once, during a lecture, that his ideas came to him between sleeping and waking. But I assumed it was metaphor. Writers are full of them." Holmes stood and began to pace. "I must speak plainly, Doctor. Mr. Beresford is suffering from more than simple fatigue. He believes his dreams are being harvested, that his creativity is being extracted." Her eyebrows lifted. "That's absurd." Holmes stopped at the window and peered out. Absurdities often leave the clearest footprints, especially when someone benefits from the emptiness that remains. At that, she bristled. "If you mean to suggest that I am siphoning his dreams like a vampire, Mr. Holmes, I assure you I have no need. I've published 3 papers this year and am preparing a lecture for Berlin." Holmes turned to her, folding his arms. "You know, of course, about the blank volume delivered to Mr. Wyndham?" "I've heard of it. Have you held it?" "No." Holmes took the book from his coat pocket. It had remained in his possession since our visit to Beresford's study. He laid it on the table between them. She hesitated, then reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the leather, something flickered across her expression. Not recognition, but an instinctive distaste, like touching a thing that remembered too much. Holmes saw it. "Curious, isn't it? How some books feel lived in, even before they're written." She released it. "There's a residue," she murmured. "But not ink." "Exactly," Holmes said. "Not ink. Impression." She narrowed her eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "That you, Dr. Arkwright, have either received or returned ideas to Mr. Beresford, perhaps without ever meeting him in person." "That's impossible." "Is it? What of your studies on dream synchronicity?" Her mouth opened, then closed. I saw the defiance drain from her shoulders. "We experimented with lucid dreaming," she said finally, "years ago. He was interested in mapping symbolic threads across unconscious narratives. He called it dream entanglement." "Was it successful?" I asked. She shrugged. "We didn't know. He claimed he saw symbols I had dreamed, and I believed him. But we abandoned the work. It was destabilizing." Holmes nodded, his tone softening slightly. "Doctor, do you keep a dream journal?" "Yes. May I see it?" She hesitated again. Then, slowly, she rose and crossed to a locked cabinet. From within, she removed a small cloth-bound volume with an embossed circle on the front. She handed it to Holmes without a word. He flipped through the entries with deft fingers, then paused. "Watson." I rose and looked over his shoulder. On the page marked April the 17th was written, in looping script, "The dream will reveal the key. The window of thought opens with no latch." It was the exact phrase from Beresford's lips. Holmes shut the book and returned it. "You may not have intended to interfere," he said, "but you are not alone in this experiment. Someone else has engineered this web. Someone who wished the book never to be written, only extracted." She looked genuinely shaken. "Then I've been used." Holmes nodded solemnly. "And we must find out by whom." He turned to me. "Watson, pack the book. We return to London. There's a clue left in the courier's movements I must inspect, and a trace of ink that never reached the page." As we exited Arkwright Hall into the gray mist, I felt the peculiar sensation that this case, which began with a blank book, now threatened to rewrite the boundaries of the mind itself. And Holmes, more silent than ever, seemed to feel it too. Chapter 4. The Ink That Wasn't There. Back at Baker Street, the fog hung low and thick, like a blanket of unspoken secrets. Holmes remained silent for the better part of our journey from Cambridge. He sat curled in the cab's corner, the unopened dream journal resting in his gloved hand, and the blank book sealed in brown paper upon his lap. I knew better than to disturb him when his thoughts were arranging themselves, brick by logical brick, into the foundation of a theory. When he finally stirred and tapped twice on the ceiling of the cab to signal the driver to halt 2 streets early, I felt the familiar tingle of anticipation. "We shall not go home just yet, Watson," Holmes said softly. "First, a call to Wyndham and Withers' courier service in Marylebone." "The couriers?" I asked. "Do you suspect the book was tampered with en route?" "I suspect something more curious still, that it never should have reached Beresford at all." The courier office was a narrow establishment squeezed between a tobacconist and a grocer's. Inside, the air smelled of dust and sealing wax. A boy of no more than 15 sat behind the counter, his fingertips blackened with ink and glue. He looked up as we entered and blinked twice at Holmes's commanding presence. "Good evening," Holmes said, removing his gloves. "We've come regarding a delivery made 5 days ago to Elliot Beresford at 14 Beaufort Row. The item was a single parcel, flat, leather-bound." The boy nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Logged under Oxford account. Sent by Mr. Beresford's publisher, I believe. Signed for at 11:12 a.m. Holmes stepped closer. "Signed for? By whom?" The boy reached under the desk and produced a ledger. With a finger smudged in ink, he flipped to the entry and pointed. "R. Blythe. That's the signature." Holmes looked at me. "Is there a Blythe in Beresford's employ?" "None mentioned," I replied. "He lives alone." Holmes turned back to the boy. "Describe the courier who made the delivery." The boy hesitated. "It wasn't one of ours that day. We'd an overflow. Called in a runner from Magpie Delivery to cover it." Holmes's expression flickered. Interest peaked. "Did you log his full name?" "Only the initials. P. G. That's all I have." Holmes thanked him and left with a bow that barely passed as polite. Outside, the fog thickened, curling around the lamplight like ghosts eavesdropping. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "That the book may have passed through hands unknown, Watson. Mr. Beresford never saw this R. Blythe. We must entertain the idea that the object delivered was not what had been sent. But the book was blank. It's not as though it was rewritten." "Ah," Holmes said, pulling the sealed package from under his arm. "But blankness, my friend, is the most mutable canvas of all. Let us examine the book anew." Back at Baker Street, the gas lamp burned steady as Holmes unwrapped the volume and placed it under his magnifier. I fetched the chemical kit without being asked. The pages of the book were turned carefully, one by one. "No impression from a pen," Holmes said. "No imprint visible in a bleak light. But—" he tapped a page near the middle and dusted it with fine charcoal powder. A faint smudge appeared. 2 lines of handwritten script invisible to the eye, now teased forth by the particles clinging to pressure indentations in the parchment. He leaned in, squinting. "Watson, read that." I bent forward, heart pounding. The letters, though faint, resolved into a single sentence. "The dreamer shall forget, but the page remembers." Holmes's mouth set into a firm line. "Someone wrote in this book and then erased it completely. Not by ink removal, no chemicals. It was never inked at all." "You mean the writing was done in pressure only?" "Precisely. And it was done to appear invisible to the naked eye, save by means such as these. But more interesting is the content. This message was left deliberately. A breadcrumb. By Beresford?" Holmes shook his head. He claimed to have no memory of ever seeing the book before. "This hand is not his. Observe the looped tail on the G. Far more feminine. It could be Arkwright's." He rose and paced. No, that would be too direct. Someone wanted the book to reach us, or Beresford, bearing a clue no one would find unless they suspected erasure. This is the mark of a mind that deals in shadows, and that raises one further question, which is, why go to such lengths to ensure Beresford received the book, but ensure he forgot it immediately after? I found myself chilled by the thought. To scramble his sense of reality? Or to bury something that was never meant to be remembered, Holmes said. Which brings us to our next inquiry. Who is R. Blythe, and why use that name? He turned suddenly to the desk, where our correspondence lay stacked. He thumbed through it quickly and pulled out a scrap of newspaper he had kept from the initial Beresford delivery. There. The column in the Cambridge Gazette, Literary News. Note the name in the last paragraph. I read aloud. Among the upcoming works in the autumn catalogue is The Sleep Script, Dreams and the Novel Form by R. Blythe. We locked eyes. It's a pseudonym, Holmes said, and a telling one. Whoever delivered the book wanted us to connect Beresford's dream loss with an upcoming publication. Someone intends to steal not just his ideas, but his very dream identity. He stepped back toward the window, staring out into the fog as though expecting it to whisper something back. We must track the author. R. Blythe is the next step. And we must be swift, Watson. For this case, I fear, is no longer about theft or sabotage. He turned, eyes glinting. It is about the ownership of imagination itself. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Mirror. The following morning brought no respite from the autumn damp, and Baker Street woke shrouded in a murky drizzle that blurred the edges of chimneys and cast the windows in pearly gloom. Holmes had not slept. I knew this without asking, for I found him in his dressing gown at the table, notes arrayed before him like the scattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. A single name was written on the center of a page in a spidery hand: R. Blythe. "Watson," Holmes said without preamble. "Do you recall the case of the Prague manuscripts?" "Vaguely." "Wasn't that the affair with the forged codex and the bishop's nephew?" "Just so. In that instance, the forger had used genuine parchment and medieval ink, but the signature was modern. The entire deception collapsed on a single anachronism. And this is relevant because R. Blythe may be a fiction crafted with similarly elegant precision. A pseudonym, yes, but also a cipher." He tapped the letters with one long finger. "I've been working through the literary catalogs. The Sleep script is listed with a boutique publishing house, Le Marchand Press, a marginal but influential outfit operating from Kensington." I rose from the hearth. "And you believe this press is involved?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that it may have been created for the sole purpose of giving this phantom author a voice." We took a hansom to Kensington, and I must admit that my curiosity mounted with every street we passed. I had seen Holmes pursue murderers, blackmailers, smugglers, and spies. But this hunt for a ghostwriter who trafficked in stolen dreams struck me as something stranger and more psychological than any case we had faced. Le Marchand Press turned out to be a curious place, a converted apothecary with stained glass windows that cast marbled shadows on the bookshelves inside. The scent of lavender and ink clung to the air. A bell chimed softly as we entered. A woman emerged from behind a curtain, tall, silver-haired, dressed in plum silk with gloves of dove-gray suede. Her eyes, framed by gold spectacles, missed nothing. "You are not customers," she said, "but I imagine you are here about R. Blythe." Holmes inclined his head. "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are investigating a matter involving Mr. Elliot Beresford." The woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, an eyelid flutter, a breath drawn just a fraction too sharply. "I see. Well, I am Marguerite Le Marchand. I founded this press 5 years ago to publish experimental literature, and Mr. Blythe, whoever he is, submitted a complete manuscript of the Sleep script by post. There was no return address, no meeting, no signature. Only a note enclosed, which I retained." She stepped to a small oak filing cabinet and withdrew a slip of creamy paper. Holmes took it reverently. The handwriting was precise, without flourish. The message read, "Publish this before October ends." The text is not mine, but it is true. R. Blythe. Holmes studied the penmanship, then passed it to me. "No ink blotting," I observed. "No address, no salutation. And the final line, it's not a claim of authorship, but of witness." "Precisely," Holmes said. "The real author, or perhaps the real victim, remains unnamed." Marguerite Le Marchand watched us closely. I sensed something uncanny about the prose. It's written with feverish clarity, like a confession dreamt at midnight. "You've read the entire manuscript?" "I have, and I have no doubt it was drawn from experience, vivid and terrifying. Whoever wrote it did not invent this world. They lived it." Holmes turned back toward the door. "May we borrow the manuscript?" She hesitated. "A copy, yes, not the original." "Quite understandable." Within the hour, we were back at Baker Street. Holmes spread the typed pages across the table. The prose was jagged, poetic, and often disjointed, narrated by a protagonist who wandered a fog-laced version of London, where streets changed names mid-step, and books whispered their contents when unopened. One passage stood out. I remember standing before the mirror and seeing not myself but a woman watching me from the other side, a woman with my name and none of my memories. She mouthed a warning. I forgot it as I turned away. Holmes tapped the page. There, the woman in the mirror. The echo of a memory that does not belong to the narrator. You believe this refers to Arkwright? I asked. I believe Arkwright, Beresford's vanished collaborator, is not missing, but dislocated. Her mind, perhaps even her identity, has been written over, Watson. Not killed, rewritten. I struggled to comprehend the implication. You're suggesting someone has devised a method to erase authorship, not merely of a manuscript, but of a person's very thoughts. Why else, Holmes said, would someone deliver a blank book with a hidden sentence and ensure that Beresford forgot its arrival? He took up his violin and began to pace, bow held idly in one hand. There is a battle being waged, not in the streets, but in the pages of memory. A story was stolen, yes, but not for publication. It was stolen to replace another. The book that wasn't written, Watson, was written too many times, each draft erasing the one before. A chill ran through me. And the dream, I said slowly. The one Beresford claimed he had. The girl dancing on the rooftop? Holmes nodded. It was not his dream, Watson. It was Arkwright's. And now someone else is dreaming it in print. R. Blythe. We sat in silence then, the fog pressing at the windows, the manuscript trembling under a stray draft. Somewhere between the mirrors and the margins, a secret was waiting to be read aloud, and Holmes was already listening. Chapter 6. A Voice in the Footnotes. The weather remained gray and unsettled, as though London itself sensed a shift in the air. Holmes had not yet slept. He had read the sleep script twice through, marking passages in red ink, muttering to himself like a man deciphering a forgotten tongue. I returned from my errands to find the manuscript in disarray, pages pinned to the curtains with thumbtacks, and several passages circled with such vehemence the ink had soaked through. "What have you found, Holmes?" I asked, removing my coat. He did not look up at first. "A structure, Watson. Not in the story, but in the very construction of the pages. Every 8th paragraph repeats a theme. Disorientation, erasure, substitution. It is patterned, but not narratively. It is encoded. Encoded how? Imagine a diary rewritten by someone who had only fragments of the original. It mimics truth, but distorts chronology. Our author, or transcriber, is hiding real memories beneath an invented fiction." I stepped closer, reading a passage he had underlined. They told me the book never existed. But I remember writing it. I remember the feel of the ribbon on the keys, the smell of paper. Now it writes itself, and I sleep with ink on my fingers and no dream to call my own. Holmes tapped the sentence. "That is the key, Watson. Arkwright, or Blythe, was experiencing a form of authorial dissociation. She remembered creating something no one else could verify. And now Beresford is entangled in that same psychological maze. You believe the act of reading this text affects the mind? Possibly, but more likely, something was done before the reading began. The text is the residue of the event, a shadow, not the cause." I took the manuscript and flipped to the back. There, nestled in a final footnote, was something neither of us had noticed. Acknowledgements. R.B. Thanks. Dr. Lucian Gray of St. Verus Institute for the Dream Archive Protocol. "Holmes," I said, showing him the line. "Does that name ring any bells?" Holmes's eyes sharpened. Lucian Gray, a neurologist and fringe academic. He gave a lecture several years ago, claiming he could extract and transcribe dreams using a form of induced trance and phonographic feedback. It was dismissed as pseudoscience. Yet here he is, acknowledged by a phantom author. Holmes had already reached for the directory. St. Verus Institute, a private clinic in Hampstead, formerly a convalescent home. It appears Dr. Gray is still there. Within the hour, we were on the road. Hampstead Heath loomed behind the Institute's wrought iron gates, a repurposed Georgian estate of faded white stone and arched windows that mirrored the overcast sky. A receptionist with a face like damp parchment met us in the vestibule. "We'd like to see Dr. Gray," Holmes said briskly. The woman blinked at us. "Dr. Gray does not receive unannounced visitors. Tell him Mr. Sherlock Holmes is here," Holmes replied. That name worked its usual magic. She returned moments later and beckoned us down a hall paneled in dark oak. Dr. Lucian Gray awaited us in a room lined with thin volumes and brass instruments, his appearance a study in contradictions, young but prematurely stooped, bright-eyed but deeply wary. "Mr. Holmes," he said, rising, "to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Holmes got straight to the point. "We are investigating the origins of a manuscript, the Sleep Script, published under the name R. Blythe. You were acknowledged in its footnotes. I presume you are familiar with the author." Gray's mouth twitched. "Familiar, yes, but not socially. Blythe was a patient, though not under that name. Her real identity was obscured even from me." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You treated her without knowing who she was." "Her mind was fractured," Gray said, his voice suddenly distant. "She was brought here by a sponsor, someone who paid privately. The girl could recite entire scenes of books she claimed to have never read. She spoke in half-formed sentences as if dictating dreams. What became of her?" "She vanished," Gray said simply. "One morning, her bed was empty, the lock on her door undisturbed, her chart removed from the archive. Only her voice remained on wax cylinders." Holmes leaned forward. "You recorded her?" She insisted. "Said it was the only way to preserve her memory. Most of the recordings are gibberish. But one cylinder, it chills me to this day." He rose, crossing to a cabinet. From within, he withdrew a lacquered phonograph box. He placed a cylinder delicately upon its spindle, adjusted the horn, and wound the crank. The voice that emerged from the machine was low, feminine, breathless. They told me I was Arkwright, but she drowned in the story. I clawed back to the page. I danced on the rooftop so no one would look down. That was the trick. Never let them look down. The voice trailed off into a hum. "Holmes," I began. But Holmes raised a finger. "Did she ever mention a man named Beresford?" Gray shook his head. "No, but she spoke often of a book that no one must finish. She feared it would overwrite her, that whoever read the final sentence would forget the first." Holmes stood. "Dr. Gray, thank you. You've been most helpful." Back in the cab, Holmes stared out at the encroaching fog. "It's a memory puzzle, Watson. A battle between author and manuscript. Someone, perhaps Arkwright, was losing her identity to a story she once wrote. And now Beresford has entered the same maze." He tapped his cane against the floor. "The next step is to find the missing page, the one that was torn from Beresford's memory. Until we do, we cannot know what truly happened the night the book arrived. And if we fail?" Holmes gave a rare, grave look. "Then the story will finish itself, and no one will remember how it began. Chapter 7. The Library Without Catalogue. Holmes had always claimed that the mind, like a good library, must be properly indexed. But in this case, we were contending with a library where the catalogue had been not merely misplaced, but rewritten by an unknown hand. That night, as the wind scraped against the windows of Baker Street like the fingers of a blind man seeking the lock, Holmes remained upright in his chair, his eyes distant, his violin untouched on the floor beside him. "Watson," he said abruptly, "have you ever considered what it would mean to lose a memory that never belonged to you?" I glanced up from my notes. "You mean a delusion?" "No, not delusion. A memory inserted, planted like a line of code into the circuitry of the brain. It would pass every internal test of authenticity. It would feel real, and worse, it would overwrite the truth." "Hypnotic suggestion," I offered. Holmes shook his head. "Crude. No, this is subtler. Gray's patient, Arkwright or Blythe, may have been both subject and originator. She may have written the manuscript, or it may have written her. But it is evident now that the text is infectious. Beresford's amnesia is not a lapse. It is a rewrite." The next morning, we took the first train to Oxford, arriving under a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Our destination was Allerton College, an obscure but ancient institution where Beresford had once lectured. If there was a key to the strange disappearance of his memories, Holmes reasoned, it might lie in the rare manuscripts collection he had been tasked with curating. We were met in the foyer of the Allerton Library by Miss Evelyn March, the current curator, a crisp, efficient woman in her early 40s, with the eyes of someone who had learned to trust paper more than people. "I remember Beresford well," she said, leading us through an arched corridor whose walls were lined with leaded glass cabinets. Brilliant, if a bit peculiar, always scribbling notes in the margins, never where one expected him to be. Was he working on anything unusual before his episode? Holmes asked. He had recently gained access to the Witherington folios, some of the strangest texts in our holdings, anonymous tracts, some written in mirror script, others bound in mismatched vellum covers. Several are palimpsests, pages written over older texts. "And are they still in the collection?" Holmes asked. Miss March hesitated, then gestured us into a side room. "They are locked in the secure archive." However, there was an incident. She produced a slim logbook and opened it to a date from the previous year, March 3rd. Beresford signed in to examine folio 17B. He never signed it out. But when I went to recover it the next morning, it was gone. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Stolen. No break-in, no signs of forced entry, and no one else had access that evening. It simply disappeared. Could it have been misfiled? We searched every shelf, every tray, even the bindings of other books. Nothing. Holmes requested to see the remaining folios. We followed Miss March through a narrow iron gate and down a spiral stair into a room that smelled of chalk and fox parchment. The archive was a crypt of forgotten thoughts, rows of tomes bound in flaking leather, their titles stamped in gold like grave markers. Folio 17A lay open on a reading desk under a brass lamp. Holmes approached it with reverence, his fingers hovering but never quite touching the page. It was written in a thin, slanted hand, each letter exact, each sentence a thread of uneasy poetry. They told me to read only the margins. The center was corrupted, but I disobeyed, and now I hear footsteps in the dark in rooms I do not remember building. They wait at the end of the page. Watson stepped closer. "Holmes, look here. This phrase, 'They wait at the end of the page.' That's the same language used in the sleep script." Holmes gave a slow nod. This isn't coincidence. It's cross-contamination, ideas leaking across manuscripts. This folio and Beresford's vanished volume are connected. He turned suddenly to Miss March. Was Beresford known to annotate his research with sketches? Yes, sometimes diagrams, sometimes strange little symbols. Why? Holmes reached for the light. The angle changed, and something shimmered faintly in the margin. He drew a piece of chalk from his coat and lightly traced over the faint discoloration. A shape emerged, a stylized eye within a square, the pupil a spiral descending into a point. Watson leaned in. "What does it mean? I've seen it before," Holmes murmured, "in a dream recounted by a medium, years ago, during a case involving a missing poet. She claimed this symbol was a doorway, one that could only be opened by forgetting why you knocked." Miss March cleared her throat nervously. "Gentlemen, is this still a literary matter?" Holmes straightened. "No, Miss March. It has become a matter of identity and of survival. If Beresford saw this symbol and attempted to decipher it, he may have triggered a form of cognitive collapse. Not madness, but deletion. A substitution of thought. We left the library at dusk, the echo of our boots chasing us down the empty hallway. Back in the carriage, Holmes was silent, his gaze fixed beyond the horizon. At last he spoke. "We are not hunting a person, Watson. We are hunting a sequence, a progression of symbols and associations that, once begun, leads to an erasure of self. The book wasn't stolen. It disappeared as intended, because it was never meant to be read to its end." He folded his hands. "And now we must find the person who commissioned that disappearance. Someone still watching, perhaps. Someone waiting at the end of the page." Chapter 8. The Dreamer at Belmore. The train to Kent bore us through a landscape, bleached by mist and the muted brown of early spring. Holmes had been uncharacteristically quiet since our departure from Oxford, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes distant. I knew better than to interrupt. When his mind took hold of a thread, it often required silence to weave it into form. It was not until we reached the outskirts of Belmore that he stirred and said, "Watson, do you recall the series of disappearances from the asylum records we studied last year?" "You mean the patients at Braxley House who vanished without discharge papers?" "Precisely. 7 in total, over 10 years. Each had been institutionalized for expressing vivid dream sequences, episodes described as contagious delusions by their physicians. I thought them merely curious at the time. But I now believe at least one of those patients may have read Folio 17b before Beresford ever laid eyes upon it." "You think the folio causes madness?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Not madness, Watson. Realignment. A deletion of consensual memory to make space for something else. An imported framework of thought, like pages sewn into the spine of another book. Our destination was the Belmore Sanatorium for the Nervously Afflicted. A red brick relic nestled between weeping trees and iron gates. The grounds were silent, save for the occasional wind chime of crows in the boughs above. We were met by the warden, Mr. Carrow, a stooped man with thinning hair and the cautious manner of one perpetually 2 steps behind the truth. "I remember Eliza Gray," he said, as we sat in his office. "Transferred here from Whitehaven in '88. Said she'd been dreaming in other people's voices. Claimed to have written a book she'd never seen before. We found pages beneath her pillow. Nonsense, mostly. Symbols and mirror writing. She disappeared 6 months later." "Escaped?" Holmes asked. Carrow frowned. "No. She was there one night, gone the next. No unlocked windows. No marks of violence. Her bed still warm. Only thing she left was a phrase scratched into the wall above her pillow. Holmes leaned forward. What did it say? Carol retrieved a faded photograph from a drawer and passed it across. I held it to the light. The message was crudely etched in a slanted, almost childlike scrawl. He said the dream ends with ink. Holmes exhaled slowly. It's the same sentence that appeared in Beresford's notebook. It's circulating like a refrain, passed from mind to mind. "May we see her room?" I asked. We followed Caro through a disused hallway. The paint peeled from the walls like old scabs, and the air was thick with the scent of camphor and mildew. Eliza Gray's cell was near the end, small and unadorned, the mattress long removed. But on the wall, faint even after years of cleaning, the message still lingered like a bruise in plaster. Holmes stepped inside and knelt beside the cot frame. He pulled from his coat a small vial of black powder, which he dusted gently over the floorboards. Within seconds, a pattern began to emerge, chalk white against the dusty black. Symbols. Dozens of them arranged in concentric rings, interlocking, overlapping, repeating like a chant. Spirals, eyes, arrows pointing inward. "It's a mnemonic trap," Holmes murmured, "a cognitive maze laid out spatially, like the encoding of a dream too large to be written in lines." Caro stared at it in horror. "We never noticed. You weren't meant to. This is not for the eye. It's for the memory." Someone taught her to arrange her thoughts so they would loop, replicate, like a virus. Holmes stood. "Watson, recall Miss March's mention of palimpsests. What if the erased manuscript wasn't merely a metaphor, but a template, meant to be rewritten in human thought? You believe Beresford, Gray, and perhaps others were used as hosts. Precisely. The human mind, trained in repetition and meaning, becomes the new parchment, and that which is forgotten is overwritten. The dream is the delivery system." We left the asylum in silence. Holmes's face was grave as we walked past the rusted gates. The sun had not broken through the clouds once that day. That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes laid out a map across the sitting-room table. Pins marked Oxford, Kent, Whitehaven, and now London, each corresponding to an individual who had interacted with a variation of the lost manuscript or its surviving symbols. "What do you see, Watson?" I studied the arrangement. They form a crescent, like a cradle. Holmes smiled faintly. "Or a mouth." He pointed to the center. "All lines point here." Fitzrovia, an antiquarian bookseller named Dorian Kincaid. He was listed in Beresford's ledger as the source of the folio's binding. "And you believe Kincaid forged the manuscript?" "I believe he is the caretaker, the one tasked with releasing these fragments into the world. A dealer not in books, but in memory. We find him. We find the origin. And the danger?" Holmes paused. "I believe we are already inside it." Chapter 9. The Bookseller Beneath the City. The shop was easy to miss. Nestled in a crooked lane off Fitzrovia's Charlotte Street, it bore no sign above the door, only a brass plate no larger than a calling card. Kincaid and Sons, Rare Works and Antiquities. The windows were warped with age, their glass so clouded one might mistake the place for long abandoned. But as Holmes placed a hand on the brass knob, a bell chimed faintly within. We stepped inside, and at once the air changed. It was cool, dry, and thick with the scent of parchment, leather, and faint. Exotic incense. The room was low-ceilinged and long, with shelves pressed tightly together like ribs, each groaning with books of varying age and provenance. There was no light save for the flicker of gas lamps, which cast long shadows across the spines, many bearing no title. A man emerged from behind a curtain at the back of the shop, thin and owl-like in his movements, with a bald pate and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked to be in his late 60s, but moved with surprising quickness. "Mr. Kincaid, I presume?" Holmes said. "Dorian Kincaid," the man replied. "And you, sir, are not here for the illuminated Koran I advertised in the March catalogue." Holmes inclined his head. "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We're making inquiries into a certain folio, purchased, perhaps indirectly, by Professor Elliot Beresford, 17B, from the Black Binder collection. Ring any bells?" Kincaid did not blink, nor even tighten a muscle. He turned with deliberate calm, and gestured for us to follow him through the curtain. "Come," he said, "not here." We passed into a narrow corridor lined not with shelves, but drawers. Each bore a number etched in Roman numerals. At the end of the passage was a staircase leading down. Kincaid took a lantern from a hook and descended with the measured steps of someone who had made the journey 1,000 times. The cellar was larger than expected, vaulted, dry, and filled with tables spread with manuscripts, scrolls, binding tools, and parchment samples in various states of decay. A cabinet of polished wood stood in the far corner, its drawers labeled in Greek, Latin, and, peculiarly, script I could not place. Kincaid turned, the lamplight casting deep shadows beneath his eyes. "You're not the first to ask after folio 17B, but you may be the last." "Who else came?" Holmes asked. "A woman, mid-30s, sharp eyes. Said she was a lecturer in comparative mythology. Bought a fragment with a symbol she'd seen in a dream. That was 2 years ago. Miss Eliza Gray." Kincaid nodded. "That's what she called herself. She paid in silver coins, antique but worthless in currency. When I examined them later, the faces had been worn completely smooth, as if they'd never borne an image." "Do you recall how you came to possess the folio?" I asked. Kincaid opened a drawer and retrieved a folio leaf encased in glass. The paper was brittle and lined with script that shimmered faintly under the light, though the ink had clearly faded over centuries. Along one margin was a small red circle with lines drawn out from it like the rays of a sun or the petals of a flower. It came to me in a crate from Trieste. No sender, no ledger. The customs officers didn't even stamp it. It was as if the box had simply arrived. He paused, but I knew what it was. Not its name, but its purpose. The folio doesn't inform. It infiltrates. Holmes studied the glass frame. It has no author. No, nor date. It is not copied. It is replicated. That's the horror of it. He looked to us, voice low. "There are books meant to be read. This one is meant to be remembered. And memory, gentlemen, is the most vulnerable form of parchment." Holmes placed the frame gently on the table and turned to Kincaid. "Tell me plainly, sir, have you read it?" Kincaid hesitated. "Only once. Enough to dream a place with no horizon. A library where the shelves bled. I saw books made of teeth. And I woke with blood on my fingertips and a name in my mouth I could not pronounce." "And you continued to keep it?" I asked. Kincaid gave a tired smile. "My father always said the rarest books are not the most valuable, but the most dangerous. I thought it mere poetry, until this one found me." Holmes straightened. "It's no longer in your possession, is it?" "No," Kincaid said. "I passed it on, not sold, passed. To a man who claimed to have seen its twin in a dream. He called himself Harrow, said he'd pay in something stronger than coin. He left no address, but he did leave a promise. When the memory completes, the city forgets." We stood in silence. Holmes finally turned to me. "Watson, take note. We are no longer chasing a book. We are chasing a pattern, a recurrence masked in the guise of myth, or illness, or art. But it has a locus, and if my deductions are correct, that locus is about to shift." "Where to?" Holmes turned to Kincaid. "The man, Harrow, did he leave anything else?" Kincaid thought for a moment, then opened another drawer. From it, he withdrew a small slip of yellowing paper. Upon it was written a single line: "When the ink is dry, the gate will open beneath the chapel at Holloway." Holmes pocketed the slip. "Then we go to Holloway." "But why a chapel?" I asked. Holmes looked grim. "Because, Watson, if you were to hide a ritual of erasure, one that wore the clothing of Scripture, you would do it in the one place memory is forgiven." We left Kincaid among his books and dreams, and as we stepped back into the foggy London dusk, I felt, though I could not explain why, that something behind us had closed forever. Chapter 10. The Chapel Beneath Holloway. The letter from Dorian Kincaid burned quietly in Holmes's inner breast pocket, a single thread leading toward Holloway's ruinous chapel. We approached the old building, as dusk draped the city in indigo shadows. The chapel, long disused, stood behind a wrought-iron gate, its windows boarded, its steeple sagging. Vines entwined the front steps like silent fingers, and the air carried the faint echoes of hymnals long silenced. Holmes pushed open the gate. It protested with a plaintive squeal. I followed him along the flagstoned path, the soles of our boots stumbling over broken tiles and creeping moss. The chapel door was locked, but we found a narrow access along the side, a gap beneath rotting boards. Holmes reached beneath and found an iron latch, releasing the door into a corridor of dank air and stillness. We entered. The lantern cast our shadows across pews coated in a fine film of dust. The nave opened onto a chancel, where an altar had collapsed long ago. Beneath the wreckage, a metal trapdoor glinted faintly. Holmes knelt beside it and pried it open with his penknife. A narrow stone staircase spiraled downward. He lit the lantern again. "Watson," he said quietly. "Kincaid's phrase, 'When the ink is dry, the gate opens beneath the chapel.' He meant this." We descended slowly. The walls were engraved with symbols similar to those found in Beresford's folios in the asylum. Eyes, spirals, arrows pointing inward. They glowed under the lantern's beam like warning glyphs. At the bottom of the stairs lay a stone floor scattered with parchment fragments, brittle and aged. Holmes crouched and brushed them aside. "These are pages torn from the original folio, or perhaps a draft. Someone tried to destroy them here." I crouched beside him. The fragments bore the same looping female script as the message we found in the blank book, and the love phrase from Arkwright's journal. Holmes reassembled the pieces on the floor, pressing them gently into a makeshift mosaic. Gradually, a phrase emerged in mirrored writing. In absence, I complete the text. Watson gasped. Holmes stood. They sought erasure by crafting absence, by making Beresford and Arkwright forget their own creation. He traced the margins. "This is ruin made ritual." A sudden clatter echoed from above. We froze. Footsteps descended the stairs. A figure emerged. A woman in scholarly dress, warm, amber hair disheveled, eyes wild with dawning pain. It was Dr. Marion Arkwright. She stared at the mosaic on the floor, recognizing at once the symbols she had hoped to bury. Holmes stepped forward gently. "Dr. Arkwright." She blinked, then staggered. "You followed me." "No," Holmes said. "We followed the pattern." Tears welled in her eyes. The ink was dry. She staggered to her knees and pressed trembling fingers to the mosaic. But I was empty. I wanted to give it a story. He said to take the folio, to hide it beneath the chapel. I thought I could salvage both memory and manuscript. Holmes knelt beside her. "You were manipulated, dear lady, but not alone. Others, those who stood to profit by replacing your voice and his, engineered the disappearance." She shook her head. "It was Gray's idea. He said the mind was like clay, that memory could be rewritten. I believed him. I wanted to remember. Yet someone else twisted the plan," Holmes said softly. "Kincaid delivered the folio. The symbol center was to trap the memory in repetition. But someone commissioned Gray's dream extraction as a weapon." Tears fell down her cheeks. "I saw him the night I disappeared. A man named Harrow. He paid in silver coins, ancient, unmarked." "Just as Kincaid described," Holmes said. "Harrow is the puppet behind the manuscript. He ensures the pattern continues." Arkwright covered her face. "I killed the story I loved." Holmes reached out. "You did no such thing. You only tried to rescue it." He turned to me. "Watson, she has given us the name we sought. Now we must find Harrow before someone else does the writing for him." Arkwright stood shakily. "Take me away from here." Holmes offered his arm. Together, leaving the chapel behind, we climbed into the dusk, holding the only surviving pieces of a narrative half realized, half erased, hoping to reconstruct not only the missing pages, but the minds that were its vessel. At the surface, the fog had thickened, but the night air felt cleaner. Holmes closed the gate gently behind us, as though sealing more than a door. He gazed upward to the gas-lit streets. "The next move, Watson, will be decisive. We pursue Harrow, and with him, the identity of the dreamer who erased herself." Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' Grand Strategy. In the quiet hours after midnight, Holmes stood at the window of our sitting room, peering into the fog-bound streets of London. His silhouette seemed drawn with purpose, a sentry awaiting action. I sat opposite. Arkwright's journal and Beresford's blank book laid open on the table before us. The fragments recovered from the chapel, pale and fragile, were arranged beside them, forming a constellation of clues that had led us through this labyrinth of memory and erasure. Holmes spoke at last, without turning. "We need to draw Harrow out." "How?" I asked, my pen half raised to the margin. "We know nothing of him save a name and the traces he left behind." "I believe he believes we are lost," Holmes replied, gently placing Arkwright's dream notebook into a leather satchel. "That the pattern continues unchecked. If he does, he will witness his own creation at work." He looked at me then. "Set the bait." "No traps?" I queried. "None that resemble the obvious," he said. "We will invite the pattern to announce itself, with a manuscript, with a meeting, with memory." Holmes drafted a letter to Kincaid, posing as a future collaborator named Rebecca Blythe, interested in republishing the lost folio. He requested an in-person meeting to examine the original twin. Simultaneously, he dispatched telegrams to all those who had been entangled, Miss March, Gray, even Wyndham, telling them he had found a final folio leaf and would meet at a designated location. Not as detective, but as publisher. "This," Holmes said, "allows Harrow to step forward. If he cares to protect the secret or complete the script, he will move. Over the next day, London passed through intervals of wan light and sudden showers. Holmes did not sleep. He refined the bait, an academic flyer promoting the rediscovered folio as a cultural phenomenon, whispered invitations placed in essay circles, a rumor seeded in the literary gossip columns. At dusk, we departed for the meeting place, a shabby yet discreet room at the back of an antiquarian cafe in Bloomsbury. Holmes and I entered, posing as literary editors. The room was modest: 2 chairs, a small desk, and a teapot of cold tea. We waited. I heard the soft click of the door's latch and looked up to see a tall figure enter, head hooded, posture calculated. A minimal nod toward Holmes, then silence. The person took the chair across from us. Holmes began. "Miss Blythe, I presume? I received your letter." The figure's voice was low, disguised, but unmistakably female. "Yes, I hear you have the folio. I wish to see it." Holmes produced a small case under the table. It clicked open to reveal a single vellum leaf intact, bearing the slit spiral symbol. The woman leaned forward. Holmes flipped it so only a fragment was visible. "No photographs," he said. "Not yet. But I can confirm its provenance." She exhaled quietly. "I need to see the rest. The folio was never whole until now." Holmes nodded. "If you can prove you are authorized, by heritage or sponsor, I will release the manuscript." Her eyes glowed beneath the hood. "Harrow claims I know him. If you are him, speak." Holmes inclined his head. "I am not Mr. Harrow, but I can facilitate contact if you show good faith." She hesitated a moment, then produced a folded scrap of heavy paper, a coin sealed with wax, bearing the same spiral symbol we had seen etched in Kincaid's fragments. Holmes leaned forward. "This is acceptable." She placed it on the table. "I am tonight only, Blythe." Holmes said quietly, "Then I'll accept your identity on that condition alone." She nodded. And for a heartbeat the room held its breath. Then she rose. "Come with me. To the vault beneath Kincaid's shop. Midnight." Holmes stood too. "We will." No more was spoken. She dropped the hood, revealing soft features framed by dark hair. I recognized her eyes, the same I had seen in Miss March's courtyards, in leaflets from Gray's clinic. Not Blythe, not Arkwright, but someone new. As she departed, she turned back, the gaslight catching the spiral etched on her palm. Holmes watched her leave, then looked at me. "She has accepted the bait," he said softly. "Now we follow her, and watch whether the pattern yields to logic, or logic to it." In that moment I felt clarity, or at least the promise of it, hovering on the edge of the unknown. The next move would decide everything. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. It was 5 minutes to midnight when Holmes and I stepped through the soot-streaked alley behind Kincaid's bookshop, our breath misting in the chill. The rain had stopped, but the air was laden with a dampness that seemed to cling to the bricks and to memory alike. Holmes moved without sound, each step measured, his cane tapping once upon the stone threshold as he rapped 3 times against the rear iron door. It opened, not with a creak, but a breath, and the figure known to us as Miss Blythe ushered us silently down the narrow torch-lit stairs. The stairwell turned twice, and the walls grew colder as we descended. At the base, a chamber opened, half vaulted and lined in soot-darkened shelves. It was a secret crypt of knowledge, and in the center stood a wide table under a single low-hanging lamp. Laid across its surface was what could only be described as a jigsaw of dreams, the so-called original folio, page after page. stitched by age and obsession. Miss Blythe stepped back, allowing Holmes and me to approach. "There are 19 pages," she said softly. "Recovered, pieced together from collectors, deathbeds, and locked basements. And one page missing. The page Harrow claimed was never to be written." Holmes reached into his satchel and drew forth the fragment we had obtained in the chapel, the one bearing the spiral and the mirrored line. With a gloved hand, he placed it at the edge of the manuscript. A tremor passed through Miss Blythe's shoulders. "The final page," she whispered. So it was written after all. Holmes turned to her. "And now it must be read." She hesitated. "Do you believe it true, Mr. Holmes, that the pattern told through these verses can alter the mind that reads it?" Watson here. I confess that something in her tone caused the back of my neck to tighten. There was fear there, yes, but reverence as well, as though she stood not before paper and ink, but scripture capable of unmaking thought itself. Holmes gave no answer, but instead moved around the table, his eyes flicking between pages. "The folio repeats certain structures," he said aloud. "Here, each second line ends in an image mirrored later by its opposite. The ink here, see how it fades, but then sharpens at the page edge. Someone tested this, copied it, perhaps amended it." He halted, then pointed to a series of initials in the lower margin. "A.K., 1872. "Arkwright," I said. Holmes nodded and turned to the final fragment. "And here again. But the ink is different, fresher, more deliberate. Someone wished to complete the cycle." He picked up the page with the spiral symbol, and with extraordinary delicacy placed it in line with the others. The text flowed seamlessly, the verse completing a phrase that began 7 pages earlier. Miss Blythe covered her mouth with her hand. "I read these pages once," she said, "and I lost 2 days. Not to sleep or illness, but to emptiness. I awoke in my rooms in Stepney with water boiling and the windows open to the rain." Holmes turned to her. "And who gave you the folio?" Her lips tightened. "No one gave it. It arrived, folded in newspaper. With only this," she reached into her coat and withdrew a card. It bore a quote handwritten in blue ink. "To name the pattern is to become its echo." Holmes studied the card. The same script as the chapel graffiti. Harrow's. At that moment, something shifted within Holmes. I know it well, that stillness in him before illumination. He drew breath, walked once around the table, then halted. "It is not a story," he said, "nor is it a scripture. It is a structure. The folio contains not meaning, but recursion, a mirror in language. Each reader completes it with their own memory, which is then rewritten in the void left by the spiral. That is the dream, pattern becoming person." He looked at me then. "Watson, do you recall Wyndham's ravings? We are read while reading. We echo because we do not choose the line." I nodded uneasily. Miss Blythe sat stunned. "So, what does that make Harrow?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Harrow is not a name. It is a role, one assigned to those who survived the pattern and then spread it. Perhaps Arkwright, perhaps others, but there is always a Harrow." A silence fell. Then Holmes said, "There is one test." He opened the final page fully and began to read, not aloud, but silently, line by line. His hand hovered over each verse, tracing the inverted rhymes, the assonance, the glyphs interwoven with letters. And then his finger stopped. He stepped back. "Watson!" "Yes, there is no missing page," Holmes said. "The folio was always complete. But the true ending is not written in ink. It is in absence. The page I brought, the one from the chapel, it is a forgery. a red herring planted to ensure we would complete the cycle. I stared at him. Then who planted it? He turned slowly to Miss Blythe, but she was gone. The door to the stairwell stood ajar. Only the coin marked with the spiral remained on the table. Holmes looked toward it. "We have been baited in turn," he said grimly. The clock struck 12. Above, the first bell of the bookshop rang, and I knew then our mystery had deepened, not resolved. A second player had entered the game, and the pattern, it seemed, was not yet complete. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. Holmes did not hesitate. The instant we saw that Miss Blythe had vanished, he was in motion, sweeping his coat around his shoulders and dashing up the narrow stone steps 2 at a time. I followed, heart pounding, clutching my revolver, though I doubted I would need it. When we reached the upper level, the bookshop was cloaked in silence, too still, too exact. A single gaslight burned in the far corner, casting long, warping shadows across the bookshelves. "She's clever," Holmes murmured, scanning the floor. "She didn't run, she melted." He moved along the perimeter, eyes darting, until he found what he sought, the faintest impression of a heel in dust, followed by another, small, light, but purposeful, leading toward a shelf marked Oriental Occultism. With a swift motion, he pressed against a wooden panel behind the books. It gave way with a click, revealing a narrow passage behind the wall. "She planned this escape in advance," Holmes muttered. "She was never merely a steward of the folio. She is part of it." "Then what now?" I asked. "Pursue her?" He turned to me, that strange light in his eyes again, the one I had come to associate with his most dangerous insights. "Pursue her, yes, but not with speed. With design." We entered the passage. It wound upward in tight spirals, and ended in the upper levels of the adjoining warehouse, through a false panel hidden behind a curtain of moldy canvas. The air here was colder, more industrial, the scent of oil and old metal mixing with mildew. Holmes found more signs: scuffed floorboards, the faint glint of a copper pin, and at last a smudge on the edge of a ladder leading upward toward a trapdoor. "She's going to the rooftops," he said. "The rooftops?" I echoed, breath catching. "Of course, she knows we know now, and that means she must ascend." He climbed the ladder swiftly, threw open the trapdoor, and emerged into the London night. I followed, coughing as cold wind hit my lungs. The skyline was bathed in moonlight, chimneys like teeth, gas lamps flickering below. Somewhere, far off, Big Ben tolled once, 1 in the morning. Then, there she was, 100 feet away, silhouetted atop a narrow parapet, her coat billowing behind her, the spiral brooch glinting like a star against her collar. She turned her face, pale, sharp, and for the first time I saw it without disguise. She was younger than she seemed, though as her eyes were old. Holmes stepped forward, voice low but resonant. "You have nowhere else to run, Miss Harrow." She did not flinch. "So, you've solved it." "Have you?" she called across the void between rooftops. "Do you understand the purpose of the folio now?" Holmes tilted his head. "I understand it was never meant to be read. It was meant to be spread. Each reader is its next stanza. The pattern is its own author. It doesn't want to end. It wants to replicate." She laughed, high, sad, and somehow beautiful. "And I was its vessel, just as Arkwright was before me. Just as you might be next." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Not I. The pattern only endures where doubt permits it. I see it now for what it is, a mechanism, not a myth, a riddle, not a revelation." She stepped closer to the edge. "I wish I could believe you," she said. But you read it, Holmes. You saw the final page. Even if you deny it now, it's inside you. Holmes did not answer. What are you going to do? I asked, stepping beside him. She'll jump if we approach. She may jump regardless, Holmes replied, then raised his voice again. Miss Harrow, you are not the first to carry this burden, and you do not have to be the last. Come with us. Let us end it properly. She hesitated. I saw her foot tremble just slightly on the ledge. I remember the first time I read it, she whispered. I was 17. It was given to me by a man in a gray coat. He said the words would make me free, but they made me empty. Every dream I had was replaced by that spiral. She turned to face Holmes fully. And now I give it to you. You'll fight it. Of course you will. You'll believe you've won. But wait. One night, years from now, you'll wake with the rhythm of its lines echoing in your thoughts, and you'll know it never truly ended. Then, in a motion swift and fluid, she stepped backward. No, I cried, rushing forward. But Holmes caught my arm. No, he said, look. Below, instead of a fall, there was a net. Industrial, thick, strung between chimneys. She landed with a practiced grace and rolled away into the darkness of another hatch, vanishing again. Holmes exhaled slowly. She planned that escape as well. She's gone, I said bitterly. For now, Holmes replied. But she gave us what we needed. What do you mean? She believes I've read the final page. She believes I carry it now. That belief gives me power, leverage. He turned back to the trap door. We don't chase her any more, Watson. We lure her. I said nothing, but I understood. The case had entered its final stage. The game was no longer pursuit. It was entrapment. The spiral, it seemed, had one more turn yet. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. We returned to Baker Street in silence, both of us changed by the rooftop encounter. Holmes did not speak as we entered our familiar quarters, but he walked directly to the fire and stirred the embers until they glowed. Then he stood there for some time, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, the light of the flames dancing in his gray eyes. Watson, he said at last, do you recall the exact placement of the brooch she wore? I blinked. The brooch? You mean the spiral pin? Yes. Did you notice where on her coat it sat? Yes, over her heart. Holmes nodded once, as though confirming something unspoken. Not a choice made for aesthetic reasons, but symbolic ones. She believes herself a guardian of something alive, something residing within her. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. You think the folio truly possesses that kind of influence? I think, Holmes said slowly, that belief can warp the mind more thoroughly than any book ever could. But that does not make the effects less dangerous. He crossed the room to the writing desk and opened the top drawer, removing the ash-covered remains of the final page, what Miss Harrow had claimed I saw him burn the night before. But now I could see that he had only scorched the corners, carefully preserving the center. The ink, though faded, was still visible, faint lines in an unfamiliar hand. A single stanza, circular in structure, repeating phrases that seemed to twist inwards upon themselves. Did you transcribe it? I asked, unsure whether I wanted to hear the answer. I did not need to, Holmes replied. The pattern is in the rhythm, not the content. It is a device, Watson, an intellectual snare. Once one begins to think along its line, the mind starts chasing its own tail. He stepped back from the page. Miss Harrow fell into it, arc right before her, and now she believes I have done the same. Have you? I asked, more afraid than I cared to admit. Holmes looked at me with a sharp, familiar smile. No, my dear Watson, but I want her to believe I have. That is the key. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something new, an envelope, crisp and white, sealed with a wax emblem bearing the same spiral. He tossed it onto the table. It arrived while we were gone. I leaned in, opening the seal. Inside was a single sentence. You are not finished reading it. Come to where it ends. Beneath, in a different hand, were coordinates, latitude and longitude, set to a remote location in Cornwall, near the edge of a seaside cliff, known locally as the Writer's Mouth. She wants to complete the ritual, Holmes murmured. She believes she can pass the burden on to me. She believes the book will survive through its next reader. And what will you do? I asked. I shall oblige her, Holmes said simply. We left the next morning, taking the early train to Penzance, and then a hired cart along the coastal roads, winding past sharp crags and fields that bent in the sea wind. The landscape here was bleak, unspoiled, an edge-of-the-world feel to it. By twilight, we reached the cliff path. There, atop a jagged overlook, stood a single figure, Miss Harrow. She waited beside a stone cairn, windswept and motionless. The spiral brooch now pinned to a dark cloak that billowed like wings. In her hand was the folio, open, pages fluttering. You came, she said as we approached. Holmes gave a slight bow. You invited me. She turned to the sea. Do you know what this place is? The locals call it the Writer's Mouth, because it sings when the wind moves through the rocks. But also, she said, because many came here seeking to write the ending of the book. None succeeded. They either disappeared or added a new page. Holmes stepped closer. I am not here to write, he said. I am here to close it. She laughed once, a sad and almost affectionate sound. You can't close it. That's not how it ends. That's the point. But it can be ended, Holmes said, when one understands that the spiral is not infinite. It is a trick, a geometric illusion, ever turning, but not everlasting. He drew a small flask from his pocket and poured its contents, kerosene, onto the open pages. No, she cried, rushing forward, but Holmes held a match above the folio. I have already read the last line, he said softly, and it ends with me. The flame caught. It rose quickly, unnatural in color, blue, then violet, then gold. Miss Harrow shrieked and backed away, shielding her eyes. The wind whipped around us, and I could have sworn I heard a distant hum, almost like chanting, fading as the fire consumed the last page. And then it was done. Ash floated into the sea. The book was no more. Holmes turned to her. It is over. But she only looked at him, hollow and stunned. You've silenced it, she whispered. But it spoke through you, don't you see? That's all it ever wanted. She backed away, step by step, until she vanished into the dark path down the cliff. We made no move to follow. The ritual, if that was what it had been, was complete. Holmes watched the horizon a moment longer, then turned and began the walk back without a word. I followed, still uncertain if we had truly escaped the spiral or simply become part of its final verse. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. We returned to London, with the smoke of Cornwall still clinging to our coats. The sea air turned to fog by the time we crossed the threshold of Baker Street once more. Holmes made no comment as we climbed the stairs. He removed his gloves with mechanical precision and hung his coat on the stand with the air of a man returning from war, not merely travel. For some time he stood at the window with his back to me, watching the street. I thought perhaps the case was over, that the burning of the book had settled the matter. But then he turned, eyes sharp as a blade, and said, "The game is not yet finished, Watson." I was startled, but Harrow fled. The folio is destroyed. She fled, yes, but not without purpose, and the folio's destruction is precisely the catalyst I hoped for. You wanted her to believe it was over. I wanted everyone to believe it was over, save the one who started this affair. Holmes crossed the room and tapped a letter that had arrived in our absence. It bore no signature, only a crest embossed with an ancient symbol, a spiral enclosed in an Ouroboros. The true architect has remained silent through all this. Too silent. And yet, within that silence lies the key. They expected me to stop with Harrow. They did not account for the final test. I frowned. A test? A ritual is never singular, Watson. It has phases. Harrow was a vessel, yes, but not the originator. No, the true hand behind this manuscript never intended to write a book. He leaned forward. They intended to write a person. I said nothing, unsure whether he spoke metaphorically or with literal weight. But Holmes was already moving again, sending telegrams, requesting records, and making appointments at the British Library and the Royal Society. Within the week, his summons bore fruit. On a rain-lashed Wednesday, we received word that the key parties had arrived, per Holmes's invitation. At precisely 6 o'clock, our drawing room became host to an unexpected collection of figures. First came Inspector Lestrade, summoned under the pretense of needing to tie loose ends to the Arkwright estate. Then unexpectedly arrived Miss Harrow herself. She entered not with the caution of a fugitive, but the dignity of a guest returning home. Dressed in mourning black and absent her spiral brooch, she looked 10 years older than when last we saw her. Following her was Professor Elias Brent, a semi-retired linguist from King's College, whom Holmes had once called the last man in London who could lie in Latin and make it sound like truth. He carried with him a small leather valise and a sharp, unreadable expression. Last of all was a man I did not recognize, tall, thin, gaunt in the extreme, with silver hair and eyes the color of polished steel. He introduced himself as Cyril Nota. The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's subtle stiffening told me he had anticipated this guest more than any other. "Thank you all for coming," Holmes began, his voice clipped and cold. The fire crackled. The rain tapped softly at the windows. "We are gathered here not to close a case," Holmes said, "but to finish a sentence. One begun not by Arkwright nor by Harrow, but by the gentleman seated among us." He gestured toward Cyril Nota. The man's smile was faint. "Mr. Holmes, surely you do not expect—" "I expect very little from men who hide in spirals," Holmes cut in. "But I do expect the truth, or failing that, a confession thinly veiled as fiction. I am merely a scholar of symbols." Holmes shook his head. "You are the last surviving member of the Riven Circle, a society of intellectual provocateurs, founded not to understand consciousness, but to manipulate it, through language, through story, through recursion." Lestrade blinked. "The what?" Holmes continued. "You created the folio not as a tome of knowledge, but as a linguistic virus, a recursive document designed to encode belief through semantic repetition. Its structure mirrors dreams. That is why it affects those who read it in sleep." Miss Harrow looked ill. "I was one of 7 entrusted with a fragment," Nota admitted at last. "We believed it could elevate human awareness." You believed it could rewrite the architecture of thought, Holmes replied. What you created was not literature. It was contagion. And yet, Nota said, you read it. You allowed it in. Holmes's eyes narrowed. I read enough to understand its end, and enough to know your goal was never the book, but its reader. Nota rose, slow and deliberate. Then you know what comes next. I do, Holmes said. From his coat, he withdrew the last page, the one Harrow thought burned. Watson and the others stared as Holmes tossed it into the hearth. The page hissed, flamed. Gone, no chant, no spiral, only ash. Cyril Notta's face contorted, not with fear, but with grief. It is ended, Holmes said, for good. Silence fell. Then Miss Harrow, her voice quiet, asked, What becomes of us now? Holmes looked into the fire. You write your own endings. And with that, he rang for tea. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. There was a rare quality to the stillness in our sitting room that evening, as if the fog outside had seeped into the air itself, muffling sound, thickening thought. Even the fire seemed subdued, its usual crackling now little more than an ambient murmur. Holmes stood with his back to the hearth, his long frame casting flickering shadows on the bookcases behind him. The faces of the gathered guests, Lestrade, Miss Harrow, Professor Brent, and Cyril Notta, were caught in an uneasy tableau of partial light and shifting expression. I had seen Holmes prepare many revelations, but seldom with such gravity. Before we begin, Holmes said, I must caution you all. What I am about to unfold is not merely an explanation of events, but an exposure of design. Not design in the criminal sense alone, but in the philosophical. This was a crime of language, a crime of belief, and, above all, a crime of authorship. Notta gave a faint laugh. Are we to be tried in metaphor, then? Holmes ignored the remark. He turned to Lestrade. You will recall the original premise of the case, that Mr. Arkwright died clutching a blank manuscript, eyes wide open, as if he had read something, when he had, in fact, read nothing. Yes, Lestrade said. The whole thing was nonsense from the beginning. On the contrary, said Holmes, it was precise nonsense. Purposeful nonsense, designed to trigger specific reactions in the minds of those who observed it. The blankness of the manuscript was not an error. It was the first sentence in a story written in ritual. He paced slowly as he spoke. Fingers steepled. Next came the disappearance of the folio, followed by its supposed reappearance. A cycle of loss and return meant to mirror a dream structure. Harrow, as its last translator, was not just a scholar, but a medium. One through whom the text could complete itself in human form. Miss Harrow looked down at her gloved hands. And so, Holmes continued, each act was not merely a deception but a performance. The missing author, the encoded dreams, the waking victims, it all formed a recursive narrative meant to compel belief. At this, Watson finally spoke. But Holmes, surely belief alone cannot kill. Holmes turned toward me gently. No, my dear Watson, but belief shapes perception. And perception is the architect of the nervous system. That is what the Riven Circle sought to prove. That language, arranged with sufficient precision, could create meaning where there was none. And meaning can move the mind as surely as a knife can cut the flesh. Pure speculation, Notta said. You cannot arrest a metaphor. But you can prosecute a fraud, said Holmes sharply. You and your circle claimed to be philosophers. In truth, you were engineers of the psyche. You used linguistics the way a chemist uses reagents, carefully, subtly, and without conscience. Nota's veneer of civility cracked for just a moment. "You misunderstand everything. We were trying to unlock the final tool of man, the rewriting of thought through art, through dream." "Indeed," Holmes said. "But dreams have limits, and so do stories. That is why I burned the final page. Not to destroy the document, but to interrupt the narrative." Lestrade cleared his throat awkwardly. "This is all well and dramatic, Mr. Holmes, but what is the crime here? Besides a few folk falling ill and an old man dying in his chair." Holmes's voice grew cold. "You wish for a charge, Inspector. Here it is: criminal fraud, conspiracy to induce psychological harm, and willful distribution of a cognitive toxin under the guise of academic inquiry." Lestrade blinked. "The victims may not have bled," Holmes said, "but they bled meaning. They lost the thread of their lives, convinced by dreams not their own." Nota rose slowly from his chair. "And what will you do with me? There is no law against a thought." Holmes stepped forward. "No law, perhaps, but there is justice, and unlike your dream, mine is very real." He nodded to Lestrade, who, after a beat of hesitation, stepped forward and took Nota by the arm. "I will contest this," Nota said calmly. "I will speak of this. The Riven Circle still has its readers." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Then they shall read about your downfall." Miss Harrow stood pale but composed. "I wish to make a statement," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "I aided the transmission of the manuscript," she said, "but I no longer believe in its purpose. I believed once it was revelation. Now I see it for what it is, plagiarism of the soul. I offer my cooperation." Holmes nodded once, with something close to respect. "Then there may yet be redemption." As Lestrade led Nota out and Miss Harrow remained behind to make her deposition, Holmes returned to his chair and struck a match. He lit his pipe, exhaled, and let silence fall. "Well," I said at last, "that is the most unusual murder I've ever encountered." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Murder, Watson, may take many forms, but the most dangerous ones begin not with blades, but with books." He said no more. The fire flickered on the hearth, and the storm outside began to fade. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. It was 3 days after the final gathering at Baker Street that the full weight of the affair came to bear on public knowledge. I had scarcely set down my pen from chronicling the case, though much of it remained too strange for print, when Holmes received a terse telegram from Lestrade. "Not charged. Press aware. Meeting at yard. Urgent." Holmes, still in his robe and slippers, read it aloud over breakfast. Eyes sharp behind the smoke of his pipe. "They are scrambling to contain the philosophical wildfire," he said dryly. "When a crime cannot be explained by means of powder or blade, the yard becomes quite nervous. They need the narrative tied in knots they can cut." "And will you go?" I asked, pushing aside the newspaper which, even that morning, had featured the curious headline, "The Book That Never Was. Mystery Deepens." "Of course," Holmes said. "We must ensure the truth is not simply filed away under irregular disturbance. Let us not allow Nota the dignity of becoming a misunderstood visionary in the public eye." We arrived at Scotland Yard just before noon. The building thrummed with nervous tension. Reporters gathered like crows outside its entrance, shouting over one another as if trying to summon meaning through volume alone. Inside, Lestrade looked older than he had just days before, a sheaf of papers clutched in one hand. He waved us into a small, grim briefing room and shut the door behind us. "He's retained counsel," Lestrade began without preamble. The man claims he was experimenting with a new form of literature. Interactive cognition, he calls it. Says the manuscript was a harmless exercise. Ah, said Holmes, sitting. The mere word's defense. An old trick. I trust you've retained the testimonies of the affected scholars. We have. Miss Harrow's statement was particularly compelling. And your testimony, of course. I've yet to give it, said Holmes. Though I may keep mine brief, let us not overfeed the beast of interpretation. Lestrade massaged his temples. There's talk now of putting it before a special tribunal, because it touches on mental instability, symbolic trauma, that sort of thing. It's all beyond my rank. Holmes steepled his fingers. Notte should not be tried as a madman, Inspector. He is not insane. He is deliberate. And that is far more dangerous. But without a tangible weapon, Lestrade said, there are limits. Holmes nodded slowly. Then let the record show this was a weapon of design, a linguistic contagion, and let his conviction be the first of its kind. We must not let cleverness grant immunity. After the meeting, we stepped into the bright afternoon. London had shaken off its fog for the moment, and the city glittered in puddles and gaslight alike. Holmes was silent as we walked. "Do you think it will hold?" I asked. "The case against him?" Holmes looked toward the horizon. "If the world is not ready to understand what he did, then at least let it fear it." We returned to Baker Street in time for tea. Mrs. Hudson had left a fresh pot and a plate of almond biscuits. Holmes sat at the window, staring out at the rain-streaked glass, pipe cradled like a relic. "And Harrow?" I ventured. "She has been invited to lecture at Oxford," Holmes said without turning. "They believe she has insights into forbidden texts. Irony, Watson, is the spine of scholarship." He paused. "She may recover. In time. And what of the Riven Circle? Scattered, fragmented, perhaps dormant for now. But belief, once released, rarely dies. It only changes shape." That night, I dreamed of blank pages, of symbols rearranging themselves behind my closed eyes. But when I awoke, it was with a curious clarity, as though Holmes's deductions had pressed meaning into the very air around us. The case, in its finality, was not recorded in the papers beyond a few sensational headlines. The public did not hunger for a crime they could not grasp. They preferred the safety of motives rooted in gold or blood. But Holmes knew better. Justice, in this instance, was not a matter of verdicts. It was a matter of interruption, halting a chain of thought before it grew teeth. And as we sat once more before the hearth, watching the embers dim into silence, Holmes said only, "One must be cautious with unfinished stories, Watson. They have a tendency to finish us." Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. It was 3 days after the arrest of Percival Notte that life at Baker Street returned, at least outwardly, to its familiar rhythm. The coal fire crackled, the windows fogged against the chill, and Holmes sat cross-legged on the hearth rug, gently plucking at the strings of his violin with a distant air. "Curious," he murmured, "more to the flames than to me. There are few instruments better suited to untangling the mind than music, Watson. A fugue, like a riddle, contains all its answers if you know where to listen." I laid aside my pen and turned to him. "Holmes," I said, "I still do not fully understand. The manuscript never existed, at least not in any physical form. And yet it caused madness, fear, death. How can we write a case report about something unwritten?" Holmes looked up. The violin bow held in midair. "Ah, but that is precisely the matter, my dear fellow. The book existed in potential, a phantom outline in the minds of those it infected. It required only suggestion to take form, like a specter glimpsed from the corner of one's vision. He set the instrument aside and stood, pacing to the mantelpiece where the remains of the Riven Circle's documents lay neatly filed. Consider what Miss Harrow said. She dreamed of a book with no author. Notte merely placed the idea of it into her path. He guided minds toward a cognitive structure that filled itself in with the reader's deepest fears. The book was a mirror, blank until you looked into it. "But how did you know?" I asked. "How did you deduce that Notte never wrote a word?" Holmes smiled faintly. Because the writing was too dangerous. He understood that language could infect. He once remarked that a truly potent story could behave like a virus, self-replicating, self-protecting. So he abandoned syntax. He made the book a shape instead, an absence with intent. He reached into his dressing gown and produced a folded slip of paper. "This, Watson, is the only thing I removed from Notte's flat before the yard arrived." He handed it to me. It was blank, utterly, pristinely blank. I blinked. "But this is the cover page," Holmes said, "the final proof. A silent scream in paper, the absence of writing as weapon." For a long while we were quiet. The fire hissed. Outside, a carriage passed in the street, iron wheels rattling on cobblestone. Then Holmes resumed his seat and poured us both a measure of brandy. "What will become of him?" I asked. "The Crown will argue madness, but Notte is no lunatic. He is a philosopher who stepped too close to the edge. The danger was not what he believed, but how well he could make others believe it too. And the Riven Circle? Scattered, for now. But belief, once awakened, does not die. It burrows. It waits. The seed of that unwritten book may yet take root in some fevered mind." I shivered and took a sip of the brandy. "Do you ever worry, Holmes, that one day you'll look too deeply into a case and find something you cannot reason away?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me, eyes sharp as flint. "I do not fear what cannot be reasoned with, Watson. I fear what can, but should not be." He stood, brushing an ash fleck from his sleeve. "But come," he said lightly. "There is word of a missing portrait in Knightsbridge, and a most peculiar letter from the Museum of Natural History. Our world, at least for now, returns to its usual absurdities." I smiled and reached for my coat. As we stepped out into the cool London evening, I cast one last glance at the shelf in the corner where Holmes had placed the blank page. He had not filed it. He had not burned it. It simply rested there, untouched, like a warning to us both. And perhaps that was the point. For some stories, especially those not written, are best left unread.